Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Adexon Fire Safety Insights podcast. Today the subject is the regulatory environment around construction products. I'm Charles Devenish, the Managing Director of Adexon Fire and Smoke Curtains. We're redefining performances and expectations around fire curtains. We've brought to market things like the elevated temperature smoke test, S200, first for the UK, C2 cycle test, 10,000 cycles, first for UK, and some very large size on horizontal fire curtains and the likes. I'm joined today by David. Can you give us an introduction, David?
Thanks, Charles. Yes, my name's David Savage. I'm a partner in the international law firm Charles Russell Speechlys. I head up their construction, engineering and projects team. And you and I first met, I think, at London Build last autumn. And we were on a panel together that you were chairing, looking at the fallout from Grenfell and the Phase 2 inquiry report. And I guess I'm here today, I suspect, because so much of our work has been impacted by the fallout from Grenfell and obviously new legislation like the Building Safety Act 2022. And yeah, we're going to have a bit of a discussion about where we've got to with the regulation of construction products in the UK.
That's excellent. So I'm sure the audience is going to really enjoy this. I'm really looking forward to it. David is an expert in his field. We all know there's been a huge amount of work done by government and by the private sector since Grenfell, and during the reports and the inquiry, we've seen things like the Testing for a Safer Future report that the government commissioned, also known as the Morel Day report. So yeah, let's get into it. The first thing I'd like to ask you, David, was around the Grenfell Phase 2 inquiry report last autumn. And just to ask you, how would you summarise the journey of the construction industry over these last 7 years?
Well, I think, before we get into the detail of where we are with construction products regulation, it is good to understand the journey that the whole industry has been on, and to remember that this, started off with the enormous tragedy of the Grenfell fire, in which 72 people tragically lost their lives. And I guess ultimately, as everyone's now had 7 years to consider and appreciate, the refurbishment of the Grenfell Tower was not a uniquely bad project with an awful and tragic set of unpredictable consequences. Rather, and in many ways, it was all too typical a project for its level of value, procured on the same flawed basis of construction economics and pressures that are still recognisable everywhere. It was discharged against a backdrop of regulatory confusion, obfuscation, and failures that stretch back literally decades. Its horrific and tragic outcome was utterly predictable. And indeed, it was predicted in astonishingly prescient terms by the residents of Grenfell Tower itself, by a number of campaigning journalists and architects, and by the House of Commons All-Party Parliamentary Group on Fire Safety, but also by some of those who were implicated directly by the findings of the Grenfell 2 inquiry. You will remember from the inquiry and the examination of witnesses in that inquiry that there was no shortage of damning email evidence as to the state of knowledge of different participants. And as that inquiry hearing demonstrated forensically and viscerally, and to an extraordinary eviscerating effect, virtually no one came to the table with clean hands. How the inquiry grappled with that Grenfell web of blame and the legal complexity of the interfaces between construction product development, the product marketing and certification processes, which we'll touch on today, design, construction, supervision and sign-off of work. This is all going to continue to be poured over in the light of the findings of the Grenfell Phase 2 inquiry report. And, we're having this discussion in this interesting period where obviously significant discussion is going on between the industry and government in the light of the findings of Grenfell Phase 2. There is a really important debate now to be had in terms of what further regulatory and legal steps are taken, bearing in mind the considerable amount that has already happened and the need to provide some time and space for the industry to adjust to the new regime under the Building Safety Act in particular, and to see the building safety regulator fully resourced and the new building control procedures fully operational. So there's a lot at stake here. Because building safety is of fundamental importance, but at the same time, we have to recognise that constant revolution in terms of change doesn't help the industry necessarily make the investment and the adjustments to produce the safe culture that we're looking to achieve. And, clearly there's more work to be done in the construction product space, as we're going to explore in a moment.
No, it's very good. You might, as a listener, might want to rewind and re-listen to that, but essentially, correct me, David, but Grenfell didn't happen because it was a combination of unfortunate circumstances on an unfortunate day. You can't really use words sufficient to describe the tragedy, but it was almost something that was going to happen, not if, but when.
Well, and indeed it had happened previously. That's the whole point. You know, the reason that the Lacanau house fire, which I think was back in 2009 in Southwark, the reason that wasn't Grenfell-esque in terms of the scale of the tragedy, and you know, several people died in the Lacanau house fire in Southwark, was because that fire broke out in the early afternoon and people could see what was happening, and the fire service response was obviously capable of being deployed in a different way to the circumstances of Grenfell. We can have a really interesting discussion about how far back you go in terms of just British government awareness of the basic additional risks associated with cladding buildings and the use of combustible product in the cladding of buildings, which of course was being done for good reasons of thermal performance of buildings. And in some cases, obviously, there was a visual improvement component alongside improving the thermal envelope performance of a building. But that these products were known to be combustible was a completely open secret. I've even heard stories that on building sites in the winter, when sand can sometimes be frozen and builders sometimes light a fire, you know, to unfreeze a block of frozen sand. I've heard anecdotal reports that cladding products were used as essentially the firelighter for on-site fire. You know, so, I mean, I've seen circulars, government circulars of one sort or another going back to the mid-1980s, which kind of, when you read them now, you winch in terms of what they were effectively putting the state on notice of. So although a lot of the discussion has been about the culpability of designers, contractors, and particularly, as we reflect today, you know, product manufacturers and how product was marketed, you know, there's also a significant culpability of government in this all.
No, well, yeah, I mean, our sort of small area, you might say, of expertise is from a manufacturer's perspective, and the marketing that goes on it's absolutely critical. You know, people would look to us as experts in our own little niche field, and they would want to be able to take what we say as verified, if you like. But we'll touch on it later. But one of the things, I think David will agree, and the listeners will be interested, but one of the things that comes out of the Phase 2 report is just the importance of that independent assessment and certification, and it's an ongoing process. So us manufacturers aren't just giving you our word for it. You're not just having to take our word for it and take on that risk, but you've actually got that independent notified body who in turn themselves are accredited by the likes of UCAS, who are verifying the manufacturing, the process, the production controls, the designs, and then they're doing ongoing surveillance, etc. Really, really important. That's sort of an area of our very, very close to us, if you like. So thanks for that, David. And moving on, got another question for you here is, where is the industry starting from on a construction products post-Grenfell?
I mean, look, it's obviously no secret the construction product manufacturers came in for particularly trenchant criticism, and in my view, quite rightly so, in the Phase 2 report. Almost everybody on the job, almost everybody was sort of incompetent at one level or another, but the report distinguishes, if you like, between mere incompetence and incompetence, dishonesty and greed, I think is the expression that is used. And that expression is used particularly in relation to a number of the construction product manufacturers. And I think the reason for that is because there was undoubtedly active manipulation, if you like, of markets and exploitation of regulatory confusion. What I think we can all see was a pretty cynical approach to the marketing of products, which in the environments into which they were going to be installed were undoubtedly going to be dangerous. So that's the sort of the starting point. So, you know, to put that into some detail, Arconic concealed from the market test data, which showed that Reynobond 55PE had a dangerous reaction to fire in its cassette form in particular. Kingspan was responsible for creating a false market in insulation products for use on buildings over 18 metres in height by misrepresenting the effect of the BS 8414 tests, i.e. they had represented that K15 in a specific facade setup passed an 8414 test, and they represented that was a sort of a wider piece of evidence for the safety of that product rather than the particular wall construction in which it had been incorporated. And Celotex obtained, with the assistance, it has to be said, of the BRE, a BS 8414 pass result on a wall construction incorporating its combustible RS5000 PIR board insulation and the testing rig that was used to achieve that test incorporated fire-resistant magnesium oxide boards at critical locations, and that was omitted by the BRE in its test reporting for that test. So the underhand approaches taken as illustrated by what I've just described succeeded because of a regulatory landscape that was, clearly incapable of doing its job effectively. So that's the sort of the starting point for this discussion. There was complete reliance on manufacturers to report test results and update where appropriate. Organisations like the BBA have historically taken no initiative in working with manufacturers to update certificates where this is required. So there's also been a lack of attention paid to the expiry dates on certificates. We can come back to this later, but obviously, as you'll be familiar, significant parts of the industry have advocated for a move towards electronic certification for precisely these sorts of reasons.
Yeah, very good, very good. No, do you think I won't answer it, I'll let you answer it, but do you think there's been an improvement in the capability of the regulatory enforcement? We've heard the expression, let's have more enforcement rather than more regulations, which in one sense is basically saying, look, let's make sure everyone's playing by the existing regulations before we start just piling more on top, and we've not got the foundation right, if you like. How do you see the improvement in the enforcement of regulations?
Well, I think what you need first and foremost is to have definitive standards that you're seeking to enforce, and then you can talk about the efficacy of the enforcement regime against known standards. And I think part of the problem here is the standard setting piece of the jigsaw hasn't been completed yet. So when one talks about the efficacy of different bodies around that, if you don't even know what you're aiming at, you can't really define conditions of success. So I guess, the question is what regulatory steps are being taken to address some of these issues. And there are two distinct issues that need to be addressed. And the government has really only sort of engaged with one of them so far. So the first issue would be ensuring that consumers and individuals who are affected by defective products have proper recourse to those responsible for the manufacture and distribution of those defective products. And then the second issue would be ensuring that the regulatory framework, which is what you were talking about, is fit for purpose and ensures that adequate checks and controls are in place to prevent unsafe materials and products being placed on buildings. So the major developments on that second issue sit within Part 5 of the Building Safety Act 2022. And these are effectively a products-orientated extension of the Defective Premises Act statutory remedies for buildings that are unfit for habitation. And the principle there is that a person will be liable to pay compensation if they have breached the construction product requirement. Now, we'll say more on that in a minute, but effectively that means that they have made a misleading marketing statement or manufacture a construction product that is inherently defective. Two different things. There's using a product in the wrong way, causing harm. And then there's where the product itself may be absolutely fine in other circumstances. And then there's obviously the manufacturing of a product which is inherently defective or dangerous. So that's the sort of the first criteria. You need to have the standard piece around what the construction product requirement is. The product in question needs to have been installed in a building which contains a residential dwelling. That's the second component. The building in which the product is installed needs to have been rendered unfit for habitation, and the building is unfit for habitation because the defective product is present within it. So those are the sort of the conditions that give you a remedy under the Defective Premises Act. Now, in those circumstances, the person breaching the construction product requirement or the person producing the misleading marketing or the inherently defective product would be liable in damages to anyone with an interest in the dwelling in question for any losses arising as a result of the building not being habitable. That new remedy has been given an extended limitation period. A limitation period is the amount of time after the cause of action has accrued in which somebody can bring a legal claim. And they've extended the limitation period from 6 years, which is the normal statutory cause of action limitation period, to 15 years, which is a considerable increase. But then there's a specific treatment for cladding-related products where that 15-year limit has been extended even further to provide for a 30-year limitation period from the commencement date of this part of the Building Safety Act legislation, which was the 28th of June 2022. So The reason for this is pretty obvious. It's to give, people like the residents of the Grenfell Tower an effective remedy that goes back to the period in which we know some of these products first came to market and started to be incorporated into buildings. That's one bit of the regulatory environment around products that has definitely moved on because of the Building Safety Act.
Very good. Yeah, well, there's an old risk formula. I think it's too simple, but it's probability times severity is risk. And just from a manufacturer's perspective, is we know what the severity is, and that may have been a constant. Maybe it's now slightly larger, the potential severity, but it's all about the probability. And if the probability was close to zero, then the risk, the deterrent to manufacturers to go off piste, you might say, or do something that they shouldn't be doing, is very, very low. So if we can increase that deterrent, the risk, by increasing the probability, that will bring more people saying, well, this is a risk that we can't afford to take. So
yeah, no, I think this is exactly how risk should be thought about. I think we see plenty of policy response which does acknowledge that. The difficulty, of course, is that there were blind sides because, for example, doing desktop studies rather than full mock-ups, and we know, we've only got a limited number of testing houses, and we know that products combined in different ways can create exponentially large. If you require everything to be the subject to a full-scale mock-up, and so there's then obviously a cost of compliance piece and a sheer capacity piece in terms of the test houses. But the problem is, if you're going to then say, okay, it's going to be a desktop study, you've got to ask the question, was that system fit for purpose in assessing the compounding of risk that you're talking about?
Yeah.
What we know went on, and clearly it's been found wanting in all sorts of ways. So there does need to be a different approach going forward.
No, it's very good. I was going to just say that, two aspects from a risk perspective. We've heard fairly senior people in the industry say things like, the construction product regulations, which is a regulation we signed up to in 2013 as a country. It's a legal obligation. It still stands, but I've heard it myself, people saying, well, there's never any prosecutions under it. So as to say, well, it's not really a risk to regard or disregard. And then one of the other things you're talking about, desktop studies and testing, really, really important point, because under the Building Safety Act, the general direction of travel is towards the European standards and system and classifications, which is generally known to be more robust, more stringent, more consistent, more risk averse. And you have things what you call XAPs, extended applications. So where a furnace will be 3 meters by 3 meters and you'll test a product, and then you go back to, under the old BS system or PFPF system, code of practice, you'll have an assessment. This should be okay. Under the extended application, it's a very rigorous and extended process. It can cost tens of thousands of pounds. For example, the cost for us to get an XAP on a product a year ago was about £80,000-90,000 under the European system of standards. Under the old BS series standards, it would have been considerably less and quicker. But there's a reason why the costs are, we had to do further furnace tests, testing the product from different aspects, such as the horizontal weight test on the retention system that we use. But yeah, it's a good thing with the Building Safety Act that we're moving towards those European standards, and the extended applications, which are mandatory under that system.
So let me react to that, because some of what you're describing is very specific to the products that you're seeking to bring to market. But just to kind of helicopter out on that.
It's excellent,
So I guess, the question is, what are the outstanding issues that we're on notice of post-Grenfell Phase 2? How are we likely to see, the regulatory environment develop from where we are? So you'll remember me referring to this term, construction product requirement. The source of that is normally considered to be 3 different pieces of legislation. So you've got the retained EU Construction Products Regulation, 2011. Yeah. Now that, as it happens, is in the process of being replaced in EU law by a new regulation that was adopted by the Commission relatively recently. It was in December 2024. The position here won't be amended by that change because that's happening within the EU. And our own version of that regulation will still derive from the 2011 version, which became subject to a retained provision as we exited the European Union. Yeah, the footprint of the EU Construction Products Regulation 2011 is still very much one of the foundational pieces here. You've then got the Construction Products Amendments EU Exit Regulations, which were passed in 2019. Yeah. And then you've got a new set of construction product regulations provided for and envisaged under the Building Safety Act, but a draft of which has yet to be published, and there's no timetable for the publishing of those draft further regulations. So at this point, we don't know exactly where that component is going to land. There's no draft new construction products regulation yet in circulation, although Schedule 11 to the Building Safety Act sets out a framework which indicates that they will follow a very similar pattern to the existing 2011 regulations that I referred to, which, as you say, were the original European ones. So what this means is that for now, at least, the Building Safety Act is only extending to consumers a civil cause of action for breaches of existing construction product regulatory laws. Further, that those laws have not yet been fundamentally altered post-Grenfell. This means that a number of issues are yet to be addressed, and many of these are the points that were made by the report you've already referred to, that Paul Morrell, who was the former UK construction advisor to government, Annalise Day, King's Counsel, in their review, which is a government review prepared for on behalf of the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, on the UK construction products testing regime. To sort of summarise all of that, the existing construction products regulatory regime in English law is imported from European law. That was not at its core a regulation directed exclusively at product safety, although that was part of its policy background, but it was more fundamentally about reducing barriers to free movement of products within the EU, the whole single market approach, if you like. So that means that existing construction products regulations do not deal with whether or not the products are inherently safe. They deal with whether or not the products conform to agreed harmonized standards. Essentially, the regulations require that where a product is covered by a designated standard, you have to prepare a declaration of performance which states that the performance of that product with respect to the various criteria that are laid down in the designated standard have been met. And that's where all these kind of accreditation bodies come in. But arguably, a more fundamental problem is that under the current rules, construction products are only caught by the regulations at all to the extent that they are covered by such a designated standard or harmonised standard in the EU terminology.
We still use both here.
Exactly. So Morrell and Day's paper suggests, or their research suggests, perhaps a little bit anecdotally, that perhaps only 1/3 of all construction products on the market in the UK are subject to designated standards.
Absolutely.
So this goes back to my point about, you were asking me about the efficacy of the regulator, and I was saying, well, efficacy against what?
Against what,
That's
absolutely.
That's the point. So there does, however, need to be a recognition that fixing all the problems in the construction product regulatory framework and the testing regimes will not eliminate the problem of construction products and materials being used in an unsafe manner.
No.
Because you've always got this category of, well, this product is fine for purpose X, but it would never be fine for purpose Y. So, even when we fixed the standards, you've still got what happens if somebody uses a product inappropriately. A combustible insulation board might be perfectly suitable for use in some very, very low risk application. It might be covered by a designated standard. It might be properly marketed and subject to a declaration of performance such that it complies with all the construction product regulatory requirements. However, it might still be put into an external wall by a contractor, and God forbid the external wall of a higher risk residential building.
Absolutely,
and notwithstanding the near total ban of combustible materials in external walls under the building regulations. So you've got to identify the range of different problems that Grenfell has shone a light onto and respond to each of the categories of those problems. And we're really, still in the foothills, I would suggest, when we talk about construction products,
very much,
of developing that system.
That's very good. So how do you see we address that problem?
So at a fundamental level, you can't stop people breaching regulations out with having highly effective and stringent enforcement regimes, which is obviously something that has been missing, self-evidently missing in the construction products regulatory sphere up until now. There are things that you can do, such as, for example, implement a clear testing regime, which leaves industry operators in no doubt as to the properties and standards that the products they're purchasing will meet. It's very important that process is not itself distorted in an inappropriate way by lobbying, by powerful market participants, such that the regulatory environment and the safety assessment piece and the performance standard setting piece is effectively a reverse engineer of some kind of market distortion in favour of a particular supplier. That's also a risk in this process. Again, it comes down to how much resource has been put into the standard setting piece to ensure that you're not getting that type of market distortion being institutionalized in standard. You need to make clear to the market what the outputs of any testing regime mean for the proposed uses of those products. So you've got the actual standard, and then you've got the use class for which the product that's been developed is declared to be safe to use within, and you have to police that as well. So something we're very likely to see, in my opinion, because the Building Safety Act makes specific provision for this in the future of UK construction products regulations, whenever they arrive, will be a distinction between ordinary construction products and safety critical construction products, i.e. those products which, if they were to fail, risk death or serious injury to a person. And I think that all construction products will be subject to, as it were, that general safety requirement. But safety critical products, including the world that you're in, Charles, of fire safety curtains, are likely to be subject to considerably more stringent criteria in order to be certified as safe, and more onerous testing requirements in order to prove the satisfaction of the underlying relevant criteria once they are set. But I mean, this is where I absolutely defer to you as a specialist manufacturer of product which undoubtedly is safety critical in its operation. Given the sort of legal landscape that I've described and tried to sort of summarize in terms of where we are today, which, as I say, bearing in mind the fundamental failures that, this whole tragic situation identified, it's frustrating that here we are 7 heading towards 8 years after Grenfell, and on the product side of the equation we haven't moved that far.
No.
But what does this space look like for you, and what do you think is going to happen in relation to the products that you're seeking to sell in, and of course also innovate and develop new products?
No, it's a very good point what you're making, and as you say, we're 7 coming up 8 years post Grenfell, and are we seeing behaviours in the industry change? Well, we can only really speak from our own sort of, you might say, niche of the industry in the fire safety market, manufacturing fire curtains. But one of the things that we say is, as you're right, the construction product regulations and harmonised standards only cover 30% or so of construction products with fire curtains. We're thankful, we're glad that our products are largely covered by harmonised standards, so we can actually offer, or it's a legal requirement actually, that manufacturers comply with those. That shouldn't be something that we try and get away from. It should be something that we embrace. What's not to like about a high level of safety and standardisation, reliability of output, performance, you might say. But then the other side, so from a legal compliance side, is, the construction product regulations is there, but then we'd like to see more enforcement around there. I think there's a lack of confidence or a lack of belief that manufacturers are going to be brought to consequence, if you like, if they disregard it. And I think behaviours would potentially bear that out, and we can read the Grenfell Phase 2 report, and then we can have a look in the mirror and say, how much has actually changed since then? We can all say it was a long time ago, but how much has actually changed since then? And one of the things we see in our space, which I will never get used to, is certifications, third-party certificates, which have quite clearly expired 18 months ago now. So there's an old British standard in the fire curtain space, BS 8524, people might be familiar with it. Putting aside the pros and cons of the standard, every standard has pros and cons, you might say, but there is no valid third-party certification for it. But we still see those certificates presented and circulated to industry, to consumers, to architects, fire engineers, building control professionals, by manufacturers as though they are in date. And the reason for this, and it's actually, I would suggest it's a shortcoming, but when they were originally issued in 2021, they had a 5-year date on them. It was subject to a 12-month annual renewal, a factory production control audit, an annual renewal. But where the manufacturers, you might say, are taking advantage of that is the date says expiry 2026. So as a consumer, you just look at that. You don't read the small print. We would say, look, read the small print on the bottom of the certificate. It's only a one-page document, and it says this is only valid in conjunction with an annual audit. And if in any doubt, contact, in this case, it's IFCC, the issuing body, and they'll confirm whether it's valid or not. And we'd say, don't take our word for it. Don't take the manufacturer's word for it. Is speak to the issuing body, the certification body, notified body, or CAB as they're called, conformity assessment body, and ask them, is this certificate valid? But from a behaviour and, you might say, culture perspective, we'd say that's way out of the park of what we should be doing as an industry 7-8 years after Grenfell, And some of these certificates are advertised on very reputable sites. So, architects, designers will be familiar with MBS Source. It's probably the go-to place for picking specifications. We've seen those certificates on there still. It's the manufacturers that are uploading them after they've expired. So people, and it'll say expiry date 2026, but it's actually expired in 2023.
So it's very fascinating to me, Charles, what you're saying, because kind of takes us full circle back to some of the comment I made at the beginning of this podcast about the institutional failures by almost everybody in terms of the spotlight that's been shone on a particular level of value of construction project in the UK market and the utter tragic predictability of so much of what happened. And I've often said publicly that I felt Grenfell was really, there were 3 crises that a single tragedy precipitated. There was the obvious crisis in terms of building regulation and the public's understandable question, how on earth did it come to be the case that thousands of buildings incorporated dangerous combustible materials? So that was clear failing in terms of building regulations, and much as that failing was compounded by the market participants in the way that we've acknowledged, ultimately that failing is government. There was obviously also, in my opinion, a failure of law, which is my area, of course, the failure of law in terms of the fact the most innocent of participants, leaseholders of flats impacted by this state of affairs, were, at least initially, the category of participant who was taking the economic hit here in terms of the rectification of buildings or the sterilisation of that part of the housing market, not being able to trade and bearing the costs of waking watch and all the rest of it. Now, of course, significant legal reform has now happened in that space intended to give considerable release to many categories of leaseholders. So there was undoubtedly a crisis in law. The third crisis, which is coming back to your point, is the crisis in ethics of the participants in the UK construction sector, and indeed, in acknowledging that some of the product suppliers that we're talking about, were large international corporations. I've already referenced the fact that there was no shortage of smoking gun emails that the inquiry found and read out, and we've all become familiar with, and the language in many of them is not language I'm going to repeat in this podcast, but people will be familiar with some of that evidence base. Changes in law, new legislation, new regulators, all the remedies that I've talked about to deal with the historic position. You're still left with the quality of people's behaviours and participation in this market, which is a hugely significant part of UK GDP, employs hundreds of thousands of people, often in quite small organisations. And we have to acknowledge that collectively we have to raise standards, including at that level.
We do, yes.
And, I don't know what the answer is. I guess as a lawyer, we kind of look to law and regulation to do the heavy lifting here. But it's also about who do we recruit, the amount of pride and training and continuous training associated with bringing people through the industry, into the industry, raising its professional standing, and so on and so forth. And you're in the industry, I'm one step removed. So I'm interested in how do you solve the ethical crisis that this
I think it's really, really simple. Really, really simple. And that is what I referred to earlier, is about risk. You don't need a huge enforcement body if the risk to manufacturers is significantly high enough that it's not worth taking. It's all about a commercial calculation at the end of the day. If it's 1 in a million chance I'm going to get caught and I can make a nice number along this, then I'll probably take the risk. If the severity of being caught and the likelihood is significantly higher, I'm not going to take that risk. Not for 80% of the market. You're always going to get bad actors. Well, they can't be, exactly controlled, if you like. What we're talking about is general behaviours and just making it look for the average commercial decision. Is this a grey area? Let's credit people with saying it's a grey area rather than black and white. But if it's grey and the severity is significant, I'm going to just steer right, left, and keep way away from that being coming to pass for us, because what you've got with all this is, and this is consumers, and when I talk about consumers, I'm talking about construction industry professionals, everyone is building up a legacy of things that we've done. So you're specifying, you're buying construction industry products, you may get away with it for years and years and years. Then there's a whole, there's 5 years, there's 10 years of built environment with those risks that have been taken. We need to all look at that. It's not just a decision today and how that may or may not play out in the next few weeks or months, but is what are we leaving behind, if you like. And as an overall legacy, like you say, that some of the durations are being lengthened out 15 years and more, which is great because it's increasing that risk, and hopefully that'll see people, well, it's not worth taking.
But ultimately, your risk of being caught is, that's still looking to law and regulation,
of course, yes,
to drive compliance.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about is self-generated ethical behaviour and moderation, not looking to make a fast buck because there's a regulatory failure or whatever it might be. It's the industry itself and the people resourcing that industry and participating in it, taking responsibility for its overall collective reputation as well. I see these things, of course, you need more effective regulation given what we know has gone on. But you also need the industry to recognise, what I'm calling the ethical failures and take more responsibility just at that level. Quite aside from whatever is happening out there in terms of how well resourced or how detailed standard setting and enforcement is.
Well, Judith Hackett spoke about gaming the system, didn't she, in her report? And that's the way we would see it is, the great majority of people want to do the right thing, actually, 90+%. But what you've got in construction is this, it's a huge overbearing pressure of cost. So, we've heard the phrase, the race to the bottom. Everyone around the table wants to do the right thing, but then all of a sudden we need to do it at X minus 10. So, and there's no movement on that. So I don't know the answer to that really, but, maybe going right up the tree to clients and procurement models and risk, and I'd have my own opinions on how construction could be made more efficient overall. Probably everyone has, a lot easier to say than do. But if efficiencies can be made in construction, better planning, job well planned is half done. The old saying, early planning, earlier engagement with manufacturers, bring costs down. You might say ultimately to the client, they can then afford to pay more, you might say, or there's more in the pot for everybody to do the job right. I mean, it's a very sort of simplistic sort of view, but that cost pressure is probably what everyone wants to do the right thing until I have to meet this number,
Yeah,
and then people are tested.
One sees exactly that pressure. I referenced it right at the beginning when I talked about the sort of recognisable economics that hasn't been re-engineered yet, and outside of certain sectors. I mean, if you're operating in the build to rent sector, for example, your interests are fully aligned in a well-managed, very safe and very durable building over time. You tend to enforce construction standards which align with your long-term ownership interests in the asset. That some people might contrast with a lot of new build house building, for example, where snagging and defects can be an issue. And obviously that's a totally different area that the Building Safety Act was trying to respond to.
Yes.
So there is this point about alignment of interests, and obviously we know that in UK construction it disaggregates pretty fast to some pretty small organisations which often didn't have the resources to invest in training and development and so on and so forth. And one thinks back with horror to some of the cross-examination, what were meant to be specialist subcontractors, for example, on the Grenfell project. I guess where we've ended up is there are highly technical pieces here, but there are also other pieces that need to move alongside the development of technical standards, the enforcement piece, the pride in the job piece, the getting it done right first time piece. It must be very frustrating if you develop a really, really good product and it's then incorporated badly or inappropriately.
Yes, yeah.
And I get that. You are product only, as I understand it, Charles, in terms of your business.
We do install as well.
You do
and
install
maintain.
as well.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, because we offer an extended warranty. So part of that is that we've done the installation as well. So yeah, we do offer that. Both basically.
So that's a great example of the kind of alignment that I was talking about.
No, it's very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that we've really called for, actually, you mentioned about standards, and Richard Millett, KC to the Grenfell Inquiry, actually flagged up how guidance documents can be contributed to by non-governmental bodies and influenced by commercial interests. And what we've said is one of the, you might say, to mitigate that perception or reality, whichever it is, it's Richard Millett's words, not mine, but is to have greater transparency about people that are involved in creating these standards. Why not? If you're on a committee or a panel creating a British standard or whatever it might be, it's part of the job, and one of the privileges and the responsibilities go together about I'm named, I'm on there, and people can see my links may or may not have been, and create more balance essentially around them, because the old saying about industry creating standards for industry, people say it, we want that to be not sayable. People can't say it anymore because, there's openness, transparency and balance. And also we see, independent voices lobbying, you might say, on behalf of manufacturers. Transparency about links and what have you it builds trust in the public generally and the industry generally, if we have transparency around that. So
you're reminding me of the expression, sunlight is a good sterilizer, isn't it, sometimes?
That's excellent. Yes, very good.
Yes,
very
perhaps that's a good point
to
end our discussion.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, David, and thanks for listening to us today. I hope you found that insightful. We did do an earlier podcast with Paul Morell, the chair for the Safe to Future report for the government, which you can find on our website. That was very insightful. Stay linked in and connected for more podcasts. Thanks for your time. See you soon.